Chapter 2 Inspector 2. Codes, Standards, and Permits. Lesson Goal. After completing this lesson, the student shall be able to explain information specific to Inspector 2 about codes, standards, and permits. Objectives. Upon successful completion of this lesson, the student shall be able to 1. Explain the role of an Inspector 2 in the local code development process. NFPA Registered 1031, 5.2.4. 2. Explain the ways an Inspector 2 will participate in code modification and appeals procedures. NFPA Registered 1031, 5.2.4. 3. Describe the role of an Inspector 2 in the permitting process. NFPA Registered 1031, 5.2.1. This is the lesson covering information specific to Inspector 2 about codes, standards, and permits. This lesson describes the local code development process, as well as code modifications and appeals. The lesson also covers additional information on the permit process specific to Inspector 2. Section I. Local Code Development Process. I. Local Code Development Process. Pages 56 to 62. Objective 1. Explain the role of an Inspector 2 in the local code development process. Local Code Development Process. The increased use of model building and fire codes has greatly simplified the process of developing a fire and life safety code for a jurisdiction. The model codes represent a consensus of expert opinions, and keeps local code developers from justifying each code section before it is formally adopted by the local legislative body. Special fire and life safety code provisions may need to be developed to address such things as local conditions and fire department requirements. Code amendments are developed locally or regionally when similar conditions exist in nearby communities. When amendments are developed, officials must take care to avoid conflicts with other portions of the Fire and Life Safety Code and other adopted codes of the community. When amendments are developed, officials must take care to avoid conflicts with other portions of the Fire and Life Safety Code and other adopted codes of the community. Process for developing or amending local codes includes the following. 1. Identify the problem. 2. Identify affected stakeholders. 3. Form a task force. 4. Draft the proposed code. 5. Submit the code for legal review. 6. Formally adopt the code. Identify the problem. The first step in developing a code or amendment involves identifying the reason it is needed to be amended or created. Most communities update all their codes at the same time for code consistency and agreement. Code amendments are presented to address the fire problem which must be justifiable to the governing body. Need for a change is recognized through observations made during the inspection process and when there is a new condition or situation in a community. Technological changes in fire protection can also be a source for change. Step 2 in the process is identify affected stakeholders. When a new code or amendment is proposed, the individuals and groups it affects should be included in development. Collectively, these individuals or groups are called stakeholders, may include members of the following: the building industry, the chambers of commerce, insurance companies, and local citizen groups. There may also be others who may have a financial or community interest in the laws governing the regulated industry that will be affected by the code. It's also important to including elected officials in the development process, as they represent the community, which encompasses all the stakeholders. The most effective way to adopt a code change or amendment is to explain accurately and realistically the benefits that the new code will bring to the community. It is also equally important is to disclose the costs needed to make the changes. Of course, it is always better to be forthright with stakeholders who may oppose the changes than it is to take a hard position that may be defeated by the local legislative body. Effective code change should be an attempt to find common ground among all parties. The next step in the process is to form a task force. A task force may be formed to evaluate or develop a new code or an amendment. The task force should be representative of the community's demographics, and the representatives may include people from the following fields: building construction trades, insurance industries, fire protection industries, allied health service organizations, local human services agencies, fire department bargaining units, real estate agencies, local governing bodies, other stakeholders. The task force duties should include scheduling meetings and work sessions, which should be open to the public. You may want to have scheduled meeting times where members from the public can attend. The task force work sessions are spent reviewing broad fire and life safety code proposals, and review model codes and select the one that best meets local needs of the community as well as the stakeholders. The group should also discuss the type and number of possible amendments to the model code and make recommendations for their inclusion. Depending upon local and state/provincial laws governing open public meetings, the task force should prepare agendas and post meeting information. Transparency is always a good thing in the process. Local municipal authority, usually the municipal clerk, should coordinate these efforts with the fire code officials' assistance. Meeting minutes should be recorded and a transcript prepared for public record. The final report of the task force should include fire and life safety code recommendations that can be used when actually drafting the proposed fire code. The task force should present their findings to the mayor, local legislative leader, and/or the municipal manager. They will usually request or assign the fire and life safety code official the task of preparing the new code legislation once the recommended change has been approved. After the task force is complete, it is now time to draft the proposed code. Drafting the proposed code. Once the task force has made recommendations, usually the fire and life safety code official, assisted by other department members, begins to write the new fire and life safety code. If a model code is being adopted, this process is simplified because it may require little or no modification. After the model code has been selected, the preparation of amendments and additions and removal of sections occurs. When a model code is altered, take care to avoid conflicts or inconsistencies between sections of the code. Processing of drafting the code should begin with the most general, broad base of code language and proceed to more specific language, reduces confusion and misinterpretations. Local additions or amendments should be inserted alongside the amended code section number. If the proposed code is a model code, number amendments using the same general system as the code. Submit code for legal review. First, once written, legal counsel should review the code, which ensures the code meets the legal standards of the community, state, and federal government. Code must protect fundamental rights guaranteed under the federal and state constitutions. Code may not single out or discriminate against individuals, it cannot differentiate the way in which provisions of the code are enforced or interpreted. Second, the Fire and Life Safety Code official is responsible for explaining the purpose of the code to the legal counsel. Must clearly describe the provisions of the proposed changes. Ensures that the legal language the council prepares completely meets the requirements of the community. Third, once completed, the code drafting committee should review it again to ensure that all of the desired provisions have been included. Meaning of each section is correct. Lastly, the final draft is then returned to the Fire and Life Safety Code official, who prepares the proposal for adoption by the local legislative board. Now it is time to formally adopt the code. Each jurisdiction's code has a legislative procedure for presenting documents for approval and inclusion into the local municipal code. Generally, the process includes 5 steps. 1. Preparation of the proposed legislation. 2. Study by the legislative body. 3. Formal presentation. 4. Discussion. 5. Legal action. Formal resolution to adopt the new Fire and Life Safety Code language should include the following elements. I. Nature of the legislation. 2. Location of the legislation within the framework of the municipal code group. 3. Authority of the community to adopt such code language. 4. Need of the community to adopt a new edition of the code to reflect local changes. B. Authority of the community to enforce the legislation. 6. Term or sunset provisions, if any, regarding the proposed code. 7. Proposed implementation date for the code once adopted. A cover letter is prepared by the fire chief or Fire and Life Safety Code official and sent to the municipal manager for review. Some municipalities may require an additional document, called a council communication or executive summary, to be included with the manager's letter. Manager then forwards copies to all municipal board members and the clerk for inclusion on the board's agenda. Now it's time to discuss legislation and adopt code. Once scheduled, it is common for the legislative body to include discussion of the proposed code during a work session. After a work session, members of the governing body may request additional provisions be developed, or other provisions be deleted or modified. The AHJ should make the requested changes and resubmit the proposed code. After the code has progressed through the study process, the governing body schedules it for formal consideration. Actual presentation of the resolution is usually made to the legislative body by one of the following people. 1. Municipal manager. 2. Member of a legislative body. 3. Manager of a municipal department that has oversight on the code. 4. Member of the Citizen Advisory Committee appointed to develop new legislation. B. Fire and Life Safety Code official acting on behalf of the fire chief. Once presented, the AHJ is typically asked to provide a detailed explanation of the proposed code changes. The board president or mayor then opens a public comment period when citizens can speak in favor of or in opposition to the proposal. Following discussion, members of the board vote on the proposal. In most communities, a simple majority is required for passage. Some communities require a supermajority for passage. Congratulations, it's now time to introduce the new code. After the enabling legislation is passed, clerk posts the new legislation and maintains a copy for public review. Effective enforcement date is contained within the legislation. Once adopted, the Fire and Life Safety Code official should immediately begin a formal notification within the community, for example, public service announcements in the following: 1. Local newspapers. 2. Radio and television stations. 3. Electronic media outlets. 4. Letters to all who have an interest in the provisions of the code. It's important to continue to present and promote the new code even after its formal adoption. This ensures a smoother transition from the old fire code to the new one. Section 2, Code Modification and Appeals Procedures. Code Modification and Appeals Procedures. Pages 62 to 65. Objective 2. Explain the ways an inspector 2 will participate in code modification and appeals procedures. Code Modification and Appeals Procedures. 1. During enforcement, it may become evident that code needs to be modified to be more effective or fair. 2. Citizens may appeal a code requirement they perceive to be unfair or overly burdensome. Code modification may also be called variances, appeals, or modifications. Modifications must meet the intent of the code as the fire official interprets it. Details of any modification must be recorded as per the local jurisdiction standards. Goal is to maintain the required safety level specified by the code. Situations that may involve requests to modify the code include: a desire to use new building materials or technologies that have not yet been recognized by the model codes and standards. Desire to use a material or technology in place of approved materials and methods. Confusion or conflicts that occasionally occur between the different model codes and standards. Desire to implement performance-based design, PBD, concepts. Need to construct special occupancies due to unique circumstances. Desire by the owner/contractor to reduce the cost of construction. Disagreement between the owner/contractor and the Fire Prevention Division regarding the local interpretation and implementation of a code or standard. Belief that the fire code does not apply to the owner/occupant or contractor. Applicant must present written requests to the AHJ, usually the Fire Prevention Division. Applicant must present written requests to the AHJ, usually the Fire Prevention Division. AHJ reviews the request to ensure that a fire code's intent is being observed and public safety is maintained. Fire and life safety inspectors acting alone have little authority to approve requests. Usually they processes requests and receives formal interpretation from 1. Superior Inspection Bureau Officer. 2. Staff Fire Protection Engineer. 3. Fire Marshal. 4. Code Official. 5. Contract Fire Protection Consultant. 6. Local Board of Appeals. 7. Code or Standards Writing Organization. After review and an official's decision, the applicant receives an official reply from the senior fire code official having jurisdiction. This should include a detailed explanation of the decision, can be used for an appeal if necessary. Also, detailed records of all decisions are generally kept in the department because they are official local interpretations of the code as applied by the jurisdiction. Appeals Procedures. Board of Appeals has the authority to interpret the fire code and approve an equivalent method of protection or safety, and issue a ruling. The board is prohibited from changing the direct intent of the code or waiving any portion of it. Inspectors must be familiar with certain issues involving the appeals process and the Board of Appeals, including whether the inspector can continue to enforce codes on the property during the appeal process, whether the ruling on the question will affect the enforcement of that section of the code or ordinance for other properties in the jurisdiction, how modification of the code will affect the enforcement of other code sections. Adopted code regulations usually specify a time limit for submitting an appeal. The board then accepts or rejects the appeal and files an appropriate notice. Rules and regulations used during appeals are established by the local municipal code or state law. Most interpretations and decisions made are general in nature and apply to similar code circumstances within a jurisdiction. Inspectors must implement rulings the same way in similar situations. Board of Appeals can use a one-time modification, referred to as a variance, binding only for a particular circumstance and not automatically applied to other situations. Approved when a situation arises that is beyond the control of the applicant and cannot be changed in a manner that meets the requirements of the code. An alternate, less efficient, option may be proposed and installed. A decision to grant a variance may be cause for concern because other applicants may expect to receive similar treatment, each circumstance evaluated separately. Section 3, Permit Process. Permit Process. Pages 65 to 67. Objective 3, describe the role of the inspector 2 in the permitting process. Permit process. 1. Process begins when the property owner/occupant recognizes the need to obtain a permit for an operation or condition that will exist on the property. A citizen is not usually familiar with this process. Inspectors are frequently contacted for guidance and should explain the permit process and emphasize that a conversation is not the same as granting a permit. Permits. Permits issued in error. Application. 1. In most jurisdictions, a property owner who wishes to obtain a permit must complete a permit application. 2. A processing fee may be required, usually non-refundable. 3. Depending on the type of permit being sought and local requirements, the applicant may be required to submit additional documentation, such as shop drawings, construction documents, plot diagrams, safety data sheets, SDSs or other chemical documentation. Research and review. 1. Once the application for a permit is received, the inspector reviews it for completeness, accuracy, supporting documents. 2. Then, the inspector needs to research the applicable standards. 3. In some jurisdictions, a permit can be issued immediately upon review and approval. 4. If deficiencies are found, the inspector must advise the applicant. Applicant is responsible for correcting deficiencies and returning requested documents. Once all requirements have been met, the permit can be issued. Issue permit. Once a permit is issued, the applicant is generally required to post the permit where the work or activity is being performed. Construction permits may stipulate that additional fire and safety inspections will occur before construction can proceed. A permit must clearly explain the conditions under which it has been issued and includes actions that are allowed, guidelines that must be followed, time frame for the permit. Most enabling legislation that grants the authority to issue permits also specifies time limits for the activity or use. Each jurisdiction should also have procedures for granting extensions if they are needed. Evaluate status. The permit is enforced for the time specified. It may be reissued, renewed, or revoked, depends on the situation. In all cases, inspectors should review the current activity status to determine if the conditions of the initial permit are still being met. If changes in the permit language are necessary, the owner/occupant may be required to submit additional documents before the permit can be renewed. The inspector has the authority to revoke a permit if an inspection reveals that stipulations in the permit are not being followed, false statements or misrepresentations were made. Revocation can be temporary or permanent pending correction of violations, depends on the circumstances. Permit issued in error. Procedure for dealing with this and the legal basis for revocation are typically found in either the Code, the enabling legislation that adopts the Code. Issue tends to be a challenging one due to the sensitive nature of revoking a privilege. Need to work closely with the AHJ on the proper procedure because it varies greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Essentially, if the jurisdiction issues a permit in error and the error is not due to gross negligence, the applicant/owner will still be responsible for correcting the deficiency. Inspector's job is to verify code compliance. If the design was deficient and the problem was missed by the inspector, the owner is still responsible for ensuring compliance. To avoid issuing permits in error, the AHJ can require special inspections for complex processes or construction, certification of compliance from the special inspector. Chapter Summary. 1. Locally adopted codes and standards provide the legal basis for the tasks that an inspector performs. 2. Codes and standards are not mandatory until they are adopted by the AHJ. Once adopted, they can be modified to meet local needs. 3. An inspector should be familiar with the code adoption and modification process, the appeals process, and the original consensus process. 4. Developing and adopting fire and life safety codes at the local level requires the involvement of interested and affected citizens and business representatives. 5. Inspectors must be aware of the necessity for including citizens, for permitting comments and discussion, and the value of working to achieve a common goal. 6. Inspectors must understand the steps needed within a jurisdiction for filing complaints. Inspectors also must be familiar with the permitting process.